Hey everybody, welcome back to Phonic Facts. Today we are going deep on Earl the Pearl Strickland,
Oh yeah, the Pearl.
one of Pool's most captivating and controversial figures.
I think anyone who follows Poole knows that name and knows at least a little bit about him, I think.
Yeah, and there's so much more to it than just like, oh, he's a great pool player. You know, he's won a lot of champions.
There's a lot of layers to this guy, yeah.
So that's what we're going to try to unpack today is like what makes him tick, what, the forces that kind of shaped him into the Earl Strickland that we know today.
Yeah, I think when you start getting into Strickland, you realize that he's so much more than just a win-loss record.
Right.
And just his accomplishments on the table.
Right.
It's really the personality, the intensity, the drive that really grabs you. And there's a lot there.
And it all starts on a farm in North Carolina. I mean, not exactly where you picture a pool legend coming from.
Right, right. I mean, you don't think of like rolling hills and, fields of wheat or whatever. Leading to, smoky pool halls, but that's exactly where it all began for him.
So at 9 years old, he picks up a cue and is pretty much instantly hooked, like obsessed.
It's like this natural talent meets this almost like obsession right from the start.
Yeah.
And he wasn't just playing, he was studying the game, he was practicing constantly,
Yeah.
seeking out tougher opponents, even as a kid, like just pushing himself to the limit.
Wow.
And you see that drive throughout his entire career.
Yeah. And then at age 15, he moves to Houston.
Ah, Houston.
Which back then was like this pool player's proving ground, right?
Oh, yeah, it was a jungle, man. It was like a shark tank of talent and hustle.
And that's where he really, honed his aggressive style.
Exactly. And you hear these stories about him in Houston giving opponents ridiculous handicaps, like spotting them the 8-ball, the 6-ball, sometimes even more.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
And still running the table.
Right.
Like just touring with them almost.
Psychological, right?
It's totally psychological. He wasn't just trying to win. He was trying to dominate to break their spirits.
Right, like show them who's boss.
Exactly. I mean, seasoned road players, guys who made their living traveling from town to town hustling.
Right.
They would avoid Houston altogether just to avoid Strickland. That's how much of a force he was.
So for years, he's thriving in this hustler's life, right? The money, the competition, the thrill of the gamble tournaments, the official circuit, that wasn't really his thing.
No, not at all.
And then there's this one local tournament that kind of changes everything.
Yeah, it's like a turning point for him.
Yeah.
Like a light bulb goes off.
So he wins this tournament, no surprise there. But what really gets to him is the crowd's reaction.
Yeah, they're not just cheering for a win, they're applauding his skill, the artistry of his play.
Right.
And I think for the first time he's getting recognized not just for winning money, but for being a truly gifted player.
And he wants more of that.
He wants more of that validation.
Not just the cash, but the respect.
Exactly.
The recognition.
Yeah, like being seen as one of the best.
Yeah.
And that kind of sets him on a path towards professional tournaments.
It's quite the path. 5 U.S. Open 9-ball championships. That's a record that still stands today.
A record that'll probably stand for a long time.
Yeah. And his style on the table, just electric, aggressive.
Powerful, man. Powerful.
Yeah.
People talk about this aura around him at the table, this intensity that you could just feel.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. You can't really understand Strickland without acknowledging the other side of the coin.
Oh, absolutely.
His personality,
Yeah.
his struggle.
In temper.
Yeah, his battles on and off the table, they're all part of the story.
There are legendary stories about his temper confrontations with opponents, refs even struggling with mental health.
It was like watching a real-life Jekyll and Hyde sometimes. This incredible talent and this, this volatility all mixed up together.
Right, and that's what we're going to dive into in the next part of the show.
Yeah, unpacking that duality is really key to understanding the Pearl. You can't separate the genius from the chaos.
It's all part of who he is.
It's all part of the package.
The triumphs and the struggle.
Exactly, and that takes us to some pretty interesting places in his career.
Right, so join us for the next part of our deep dive on Earl the Pearl Strickland.
We'll be right back. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2025-02-13, part 2 of 3. Yeah, so we left off talking about Strickland's kind of volatile personality, right?
Like the Jekyll and Hyde thing.
Exactly. And nowhere is that more apparent than in his involvement in the Mosconi Cup.
Oh, yeah, the Mosconi Cup Europe versus USA.
The biggest stage in team pool.
And for a guy like Strickland who's so used to doing his own thing.
Right.
Relying on his own skill and nerve.
Right, like a lone wolf.
Yeah, it must have been a real adjustment.
It was a huge adjustment. And, you see that tension play out throughout his Mosconi Cup career.
So how did it go? I mean, I've heard stories about him clashing with teammates, getting into it with officials, even like having run-ins with the audience.
Oh, yeah, it was a wild ride, man.
A day.
I mean, remember that Jekyll and Hyde we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, the Moscone Cup brought it out in full force.
Really?
There were times when he single-handedly carried the U.S. team,
Wow.
pulling off shots nobody else could even dream of.
Right.
But then there'd be these meltdowns, arguments, moments that had everyone wondering if he was more trouble than he was worth.
It sounds like a roller coaster.
It was a total roller coaster, man. You never knew what you were going to get with Strickland.
But amidst all the chaos, there was this one partnership that really stood out, right?
Oh, yeah. His pairing with Rodney Morris.
Those two were amazing together.
They were like the dynamic duo of the Moscone Cup.
What made them click so well?
Well, they were both incredible shot makers.
Yeah.
Both aggressive, but somehow they balanced each other out.
It's like they had this unspoken understanding of each other's game.
Exactly, and they fed off each other's energy.
And they never lost a match together.
Never lost a match. That's how dominant they were.
That's incredible.
It was something special to watch.
But even with all that success, Strickland's emotions were always simmering beneath the surface, right?
Oh, yeah, always.
Like a volcano waiting to erupt.
Exactly, and it all comes to a head at the 2005 Moscone Cup.
This is where we see a different side of Strickland, right?
We see a side of him that we rarely witness.
So he's named MVP of the tournament, a huge honor, recognizing his incredible performance.
And for once, he's speechless.
Really?
Emotional, almost vulnerable.
Yeah.
You realize there's this depth to him, this longing for acceptance and recognition that goes beyond all the bravado.
It's a human moment for a guy who is often portrayed as this larger-than-life character.
Exactly, and it makes you realize that there's more to Strickland than meets the eye.
And it kind of leads us to a bittersweet part of the story, the decline of professional pool and what that means for a guy like Strickland.
Yeah, it's like watching a party wind down. You know, the 90s were a boom time for pool, big money sponsorships, media attention.
Right?
And then by the early 2000s, it starts fading.
And the players who are making a good living are struggling to keep up.
Exactly, those lucrative tournaments, dried up exhibition matches become harder to come by.
Strickland himself has talked about having to live in a big city like New York just to find enough games to scrape by.
Yeah, it's a tough reality for someone who is at the top of the sport.
You could hear the disappointment in his voice when he talks about the lack of respect for the game, how it's been sidelined by the mainstream.
Yeah, it's like he's watching something he loves slip away.
And it makes you wonder how much of his frustration, his anger, even his outbursts were tied to seeing the game he loved lose its place in the world.
It's a valid question. How do you separate the person from the circumstances?
Right.
Strickland poured his heart and soul into pool, and to see it struggling must have been incredibly painful.
So where does that leave us with Earl of the Pearl Strickland champion, villain, tragic figure, or maybe a bit of all of them?
I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Do we focus on the championships, the impossible shots, the sheer dominance?
Or do we factor in the outbursts, the conflicts, the moments that made us question his character?
It's a tough one. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode, 2025-0213, part 3 of 3.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It really makes you think about the human side of all this.
Yeah,
You know, we love to put these athletes up on pedestals,
right.
but they're just as complicated and flawed as the rest of us.
Yeah, and in Strickland's case, those complexities were on full display. You saw the gradients, the drive, the passion,
Right.
but also those demons that he was wrestling with.
Yeah, and it raises the question, how do we reconcile those two sides?
Yeah.
I mean, do we judge his legacy purely on his skill, his wins?
Right.
Or do we have to factor in the controversies, the outbursts,
Yeah, it's tough. Is it possible to separate the art from the artist, or is it all intertwined?
It's a question that comes up a lot with, artists and athletes, and I don't know if there's an easy answer.
I mean, you can't deny his impact on the game, right? He was a true innovator, always pushing the limits of what was possible on the table. Absolutely, and you see it in the way he approached the game, his aggressive style, his psychological tactics.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid to intimidate his opponents, get in their heads like he was playing a different game.
It was a mental game as much as a physical one.
Yeah.
And you can see his influence in a whole generation of players that came after him.
Oh, yeah.
Guys who adopted his style, his intensity, even if they didn't necessarily have his, let's say, flair for the dramatic.
Right.
There's a reason they called him the Pearl. He was one of a kind of rare talent with a personality to match.
Yeah.
He shook things up, he challenged the establishment, and he made pool a lot more exciting to watch.
So for all his flaws, all the controversies, he left an undeniable mark on the sport.
No doubt about it.
He brought attention to pool, good or bad, and pushed it in new directions.
He was a showman, an entertainer, a lightning rod.
Yeah.
And even though the sport itself has struggled in recent years, Strickland's legacy endures.
It does. He's a reminder that greatness often comes at a cost,
Right.
both to the individual and to those around them.
Yeah, but it also reminds us that the human story, even in the world of sports, is never simple.
Right.
Strickland's story is a reminder to look beyond the headlines,
Yeah.
the wins and losses, and appreciate the complexities of a life lived in the spotlight, a life dedicated to a game that he loved, even when it didn't love him back in the same way.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's been a fascinating journey, this deep dive into the world of professional pool through the lens of one of its most iconic figures, Earl the Pearl Strickland.
And I think that's what makes these deep dives so interesting, right? You
Yeah.
get to see beyond the surface and really understand what makes these people tick.
Yeah, explore the triumphs and the struggles, the good, the bad, the whole picture.
Exactly.
We hope you enjoyed it. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.